So folks can see my agenda. I'm going to drop some links in the chat that are always helpful as we start off. So I will get those in now before we jump into it. And then some of these, if you want to follow along as we're going through our review of the CA Core Plus practitioner profile, some of these links will be kind of helpful in kind of walking along on your own computer if you're interested. So let me get this all put in there. Okay, so it's not the best formatting for putting it into chat, but the links are there. And we're 2 minutes over. So I will kind of do the housekeeping now, and then we'll kick it off. I'll put the rest of the links in the chat now. So for anyone that's just joining us, we have been completing a community review from the CA baseline community perspective for the last 6 or 7 sessions or so. So starting kind of at the beginning of the new year, and looking specifically at the very early iteration, like 0.1 CA Core Plus profiles that are coming out of the inputs from the Pan-Canadian Data Content Framework. So we have been using this time as the CA baseline to do some comparisons against the constraints that are already in place in the baseline, to provide feedback towards that draft ballot of, any items that we need more kind of clarity on, either from the definition or from the way it's been modeled, and feedback on whether or not kind of the mappings that are in play make sense, or if there are impacts to certain expectations on the elements in play. And so we spent a good deal of time on patient previously. And so there's a lot of sessions. I actually think sessions 1 through 5 are patient. If you haven't caught them and you are interested either in reviewing the feedback that's gone to date or in listening to some of our discussions around patient, because there are some interesting kind of conversations we're having around kind of impacts of some elements over others. You can find that in the YouTube playlist. I put the link as the first set of links in the chat. We also have a Google Docs spreadsheet, and particularly because I'm walking through this more as a facilitator from the core author perspective, trying to answer questions and walk through material while the CA baseline community provides feedback. Folks like Elliot have kind of volunteered to start to capture the feedback in our Excel spreadsheet that we'll be putting forward for submission with the updated March 8th deadline for providing our feedback towards this round of profiles. So that link is in the chat if you are either interested in what we're doing to date, or for example, if you want to submit as an individual or as an organization outside of the CA baseline. This release details and feedback instructions will give you like the same template that we're using as a community to walk through and identify, this is something that we have questions on, or we have a request for change on with the profiles that we're going over. Like I mentioned, we're looking at 0.1 draft of the guide. So, the guide content is versioned. It's in line with what you would see just on the simplifier page today, but our goal is to kind of be version specific moving forward. So if you are reviewing alongside us, do use the link in the chat. The only other housekeeping item I was going to mention is Joni wonderfully got approval to share her slides on the patient relationship versus role modeling updates that she was speaking to on last week's session regarding the discussions that are coming out of patient admin from the HL7 working group perspective, and those approaches for what to do about the separation of this concept in later releases in FHIR, and how implementers like ourselves that are working in earlier versions like R4 should adapt to this. So we've got some comments in our submission spreadsheet around this, but if you're interested in the conversations that have happened to date at HL7, that OwnCloud link, which is I think the 3rd link in the chat, is where you can go and download it. If you scroll to the very bottom, you'll see like the patient relationship role modeling deck. So hopefully folks will have access to that, easy peasy. Let me know if that isn't the case.
So I downloaded it yesterday, so it's there and available.
Beautiful. So we're returning to our conversation around practitioner today. And I was just gonna kind of level set where we left off. So we reviewed, like, as part of our approach, we start by reviewing the profile against the CA baseline profile. So we looked at CA baseline practitioner rules against the CA core patient rules last time. Now, we are obviously in a very early state of the CA core profiles, so we don't have cardinalities in place yet. So we couldn't fully kind of evaluate whether or not the invariant rule on name that we have in the CA baseline is met or will be met. So I've just noted it as something that we're going to flag as for a follow-up round. So the next time we look at practitioner, when there's cardinality in place, we're going to look at that rule again from the CA baseline and see, is this something that we need to adjust from the CA baseline perspective? Is it something we need to ask for adjustment on the CA core perspective? But the timing, I think, just given the cardinality isn't in place yet, it didn't make sense to try to push too much of it at this stage. So I've noted it for kind of a follow-up item for the CA baseline community, during our next kind of round that we do this, if we choose to do this in this avenue again. Where we left off, we started to review obligations. So like expectations that are the new type of structure that we're using to express kind of what we used to call kind of must support. So we'll kind of continue in our approach in like looking at what obligations are in place on the CA Core Plus practitioner profile to date. And I think where we left off after listening back to the last session is we were looking at kind of the registration identifier definitions and determining whether or not we needed further clarity on those definitions if folks felt like they understood it enough to provide the feedback on obligation. And then to talk about go through the rest of the exercise, which is like looking at the mappings, looking at some of the items that have been called out for like explicit feedback around like licensure versus qualifications. So we've got a lot that I think are interesting topics to delve into practitioner today, but I just wanted to recap for folks that this last week's been a long one. So to kind of keep you guys up to date with where we left off. Any questions before we kick it off? I'm just going to see if Elliot's on the call. Jason, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, so this is probably going to be a newbie question since it's the first time I'm joining, but I've had a lot of extensive time in the US working on these IGs. So it looks like obligations is a Fire R5 protocol or mechanism, and we're talking Fire R4 still. Is that correct?
Well, with an asterisk, which is that it was introduced in R5, but has been introduced as a cross version extension, which means you can use it in R4.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, a lot of implementers are very familiar with must support. So like obligation, it took me a little bit to figure out if that was the same as must support. So I don't know if that is helpful or not, but it was very confusing at first when I was looking at this today, trying to figure out what obligations meant versus must support, just because we're so used to must support everywhere else.
Well, and to that point, it's still very early, right? So the one of the things that we kind of touched on in our framing session is that we're within the CA Core Plus profiles and the current state, we're kind of using it to be more explicit about who has an expectation and what the structured expectation is. We know obviously this is very early on, and many guides may choose to hold off because, for example, the extensions registry where this is hosted is undergoing ballot right now, and these things could change. But as a mechanism for facilitating like better understanding, that's of what a server or what an app might be expected to do. That's how we're using obligations to date. So kind of take it with that grain of salt that at this point in time, it's not around necessarily like testing, but it's more just, can we be more explicit and structured in what our expectations are? I saw someone's hand go up right after that. Was there another question or?
It was me, Sheridan. This is Michelle Bruff from Oracle Health, and I was going to piggyback off of Jason. Hey, Jason. Just in terms of that, the Canadian Core Plus or the Canadian Core, and how much alignment you think there might be, or you all would anticipate there being to, say, existing releases of Fire versus any maybe market specific modifications to best fit the market.
So that's a really good question. Lorraine, I'm guessing your hand, just tell me whether or not before I respond, was it to something additional, right?
It was back to the must support, but you should answer this question first.
Okay, perfect. So for like where the CA Core Plus profiles are right now, wherever possible, we are trying to, if there's a good mapping, and I'm speaking from on behalf as one of the authors, when there is a good mapping to an established element in fire, to utilize that element and to utilize intersection that we have with the communities like this to understand, is that something that is going to be actively used, or, is there a different pattern that we're expecting in place from our systems today? That being said, the inputs, the Pan-Canadian Data Content Framework that is ultimately driving kind of our goals for what types of data and what structures for that data should be available long-term in our Canadian system is the ultimate driver of this work. So when there is something that, for instance, like relationship role and code is a perfect example. When there is a need to be able to kind of convey both structures, and we don't necessarily want to try to fit a round peg in a square hole, that's where we're trying to drive, like, are there alternatives that we can align to and try to align to what's happening internationally, specifically within HL7, to guide, for instance, maybe a pre-adoption extension as an avenue forward, so that you are preparing for structures that are going to be consistent and standardized globally, even if they aren't something that's in R4 today. So that's one of the examples that we've run into. But as we go through this process, one of the things that I think as a community that's reviewing this, you should be looking for is, does the mapping make sense? Is the mapping to something that I understand is being used in production today? Are there extensions that are being in place? What are the impacts to my systems? Those are all the things that we're looking for feedback on.
Okay, thanks. And Lorraine, would you mind if I just ask, hopefully it's a simple follow-up.
Keep going.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, so Sheridan, so I know Fire R5 is already published and nothing else will be added to it. So is the intention to pursue perhaps inclusion of like Canada Core in Fire R6 or future iterations of Fire?
So I'll answer maybe in a different way. So which is to say, when an element exists and it's being introduced into R6, sometimes, and this is true of the CA baseline and it's true of the CA core and probably many of our authors, is that rather than just trying to make up an extension on our own, which is, not going to be repeatable, we try to see if something could be pre-adopted from R5 or R6. One of the opportunities I think we have nationally as a community that is focusing on, our information model and its expression in fire, is when we come across something that doesn't have a good mapping to it, we don't have an existing extension or we don't have an existing element in R6, we also have the opportunity to influence what goes into HL7 internationally to say, hey, we're coming across this element. We don't think there's a really good spot for it. Is this something that could be considered? So that we're not trying to do things on our own in Canada that probably are relevant to other folks as well.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Sheridan. And thanks, Lorraine.
Yeah, no, my comment was just to Jason's question about obligation, because in the versus must support in the fall, I think it was probably the November timeframe, we spent 1 or 2 weeks going through the obligation framework in detail. So you might want to go back and see if you can find that recording if you're interested in, our discussion around obligation.
That is a great plug. It's on the playlist. So yeah, and those ones are actually explicitly labeled for like the ones where we did obligation kind of about like review and understanding and kind of working through what that meant as a community. Any other questions, comments before we look at practitioner?
You mentioned value sets and like bindings and things like that. Like, do you guys have like limits on what you can use? Like, obviously in the United States, we use HL7 a ton, but we also use, I guess as we could term it, VSAC a lot for different value set mappings. Are you guys limited at all on what you guys can utilize from those different systems?
So I'm going to answer on the CA Core kind of current state, and then I think we've got, maybe we've got someone from the framework on the call to talk about like terminology approach beyond what the current state is. So current state, 0.1 does not introduce any terminology expectations. So it's just, can we get the structures right before we tie in those additional constraints? The goal of the Pan-Canadian Data Content Framework is to start looking at terminology, to assess what's in use by HL7, to assess what's in use in production in Canada already, and to start to try to identify some of that terminology that might be introduced in the core. At this point in time, we don't have, that's one of what's coming for some of the resources in this next round. But, you know, we'd be looking at kind of the binding strengths and the expectations that are aligned to those, being informed by, you know, how actively and how rigid some of that terminology in place today is. Correct me if I'm wrong, any folks from CAI, if I've said anything out of bounds, or if there's anything to add to that.
Hi, Sheridan. It's Shannon, just chiming in from CAI. No, I think everything that you said is completely correct. I think one of the ways that this work is different from sort of what's gone on in the US with the US CDI is that we are developing sort of fulsome value sets for each of kind of the concepts. So that work is ongoing and exactly like you said, Sheridan.
Okay, I see Lorraine and then Thomas had a hand up after that.
Yeah, for a lot of our current implementation guides, Jason, we're binding to the existing Canadian value sets that we used in V3 via our terminology gateway and or the international value sets, depending upon what best fits the business here, particularly around the registry space, where we've got existing legacy systems who are using the existing defined value sets. For instance, practitioner role.specialty. Those things are actually showing up in our implementation guides to be consistent with the systems that are supporting our FHIR interfaces. So there's, I don't know that we have any specific constraints other than we tend not to use VSAC very much because VSAC is a value set publishing mechanism that's very, that while it can be used internationally, it is very US centric. And it's certainly there to support consolidated CDA and a bunch of the value sets that are in US core, et cetera. But it's not a common place that we tend to bind right now.
Thomas, was there another comment on that?
May not on this topic. My topic could be treated a cliche now. Just do back to the mass support. That's a interesting tack here, and also now for the CA Core, the obligation also be introduced in that manner. I just wonder, is that a possible, just not in today's meeting, maybe the following meeting with the consultation with those FHIR FMG or infrastructure FHIR so could have I call it a really comprehensive introduction regarding the mass support combined with the obligation there how be utilized within the architecture context could be provided, not just like one line or one paragraph definition. Actually, my perception tells me that doesn't work. So make sure we do have a really good understanding about obligation plus mass support, which has been applied to the CA Core work. Just stop here. Thank you.
So I actually think there might be a really good opportunity. Ron, I'm going to put you on this on point here, but maybe this would be something that would be good for an HL7 community call because it will obviously be usable for beyond the core, and it is something that's HL7 content that's being put forward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a very good idea. And Thomas, if you've got specific the comments you just made, for example, what we'd want to do is seed that conversation at on the HL7 Canada call. But yeah, I think it's very appropriate for sharing more broadly.
Yeah, and Lloyd McKenzie was one of the principal authors of this from FHIR-I, gave a presentation at FHIR North on obligation and permissions relative to must support and other conformance concepts. And I don't know if he'd be willing to join one of our calls, but he certainly has an existing CAN presentation that he's just presented in the last few months that actually might be quite useful.
And could we have the shareable copy posted in full way? I saw another person has hands up already. I just stopped here. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
but,
we'll circle back on that and see if we can maybe share it ahead of time. But I do want to make sure that we're not getting too off course for what we're hoping to talk through today. So, Reba, was there another question or comment?
Yeah, sorry. I think I want to just very quickly, I just don't want to take more time. Just go on back to the terminology. I know we are not still there, but just a question. So when we're talking about the terminology and we were talking about the binding strengths, so just this is my question. Can we deviate from the what binding strength on fire is?
It depends on what the binding strength is. So actually, another plug, there is a really great resource that's available to folks, maybe as a pre-read, that is called GIST. So it's the Jurisdiction Implementation Style Guide. It's not just exclusive for jurisdictions, but it has some really good call outs for some of the rulings that are around binding strength. So what you can and can't play with as a profiler, and what the implications are if you change them. So I'm going to just drop that in the chat. Might be another topic to return to on a candidate community call if there are folks that are interested in like just what the patterns are often that we have to work with, either from terminology that's defined in the base spec versus terminology that's defined in like a national spec.
Okay. So just I just give a very quick overview of what I'm asking, why I'm asking this, because for example, we have value sets at the moment in fire which are not properly standardized. Still, we are using V2 and V3 value sets, which we can standardize them by the SNOMED CT codes, which we are not able because the value set is required, like a gender. It's like required binding, so we cannot do anything about it, technically, because it's required, but definitely we need to do some changes on that. And we want to, I think one of the goals of this group should be moving towards more international standardization with the proper controlled standardized code system like the SNOMED CT. So that was just a very quick overview of what I meant by this question. Thank you.
So Fariba, what I'll say is when we go through the next round, which we're going to be looking at kind of some of the profiles that will be introduced in 0.2, we'll have some terminology associated with them. So please do attend. I think we'll do a call to see if this community wants to do another community review like we've been doing, but please share your thoughts on if we're hitting the mark or we're not hitting the mark, and both on the terminology and the binding strengths at that point. We just don't have any in place for the review for the 0.1 at this point.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
sure.
for that specific topic, have a look at the SNOMED CT value set that's bound for gender identity and the gender identity extensions.
Yeah,
the
gender
gender-
identity, yeah, we are using it already with some of our projects because this is new. And so we are using gender identity and created this SNOMED CT value set, which I have done myself for many projects, which we are doing at Ontario Health here. But I was talking about, like, for example, a gender, administrative gender, what is like in a question, and a very interesting topic, and it's on never end topic to discuss.
There's lots of things to say about that, but probably not here.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Not here yet, but we do want
Yet.
those opinions when we do have terminology to review
Sure.
from the profile perspective.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to jump to practitioner. I'll put the link in the chat for anyone that's looking at this. And where we left off last. So we had some comments around practitioner can send no error obligations on billing. And basically what we had talked about was there's plenty of use cases where being expected to have a billing identifier supported or in place doesn't extend to, at least the way it's currently identified. And so as kind of a reminder from last session, when you see this kind of like element colon phrase, what this is basically saying is the slice, so the billing slice or the registration slice or the NUPI slice, that the expectation is that the components of that slice carry this obligation of can send and no error. And so the feedback from last time was that I think there was a specific example around pharmacy and prescriptions, but there might be others where we just wouldn't expect systems that are configured and have use of this kind of general practitioner profile to have to demonstrate they can have a billing identifier captured and exchanged. So that was one of the first ones that we looked at from a kind of feedback on this kind of obligation section. And we've been kind of jumping between these to look at the definitions. I see that there's a hand up. Let me just go to it's from Rita.
Yeah. So, yeah, I totally agree with that, very often you won't know the billing information. I know any doctor will know their CPSO number, like in Ontario, their CPSO number and their OHIP billing number, because every doctor knows those two numbers. But the NUPI number, which I'm assuming is going to be the MINC number, very few doctors know their MINC number. So the doctor themselves would be hard put to provide it, but not just that. If you're getting getting it from somebody else, like a referring doctor, or referring to somebody, you definitely won't know their billing number or their NUPI number. So I think anything more than their CPSO number, their provincial registration number, is going to be hard trying to enforce that
And the question really is, when we're talking about can send for generalized systems, it's saying that we expect that pretty much all of the systems will be able to send that information. And yes, every doctor knows their billing number, but that doesn't mean it's appropriate for us to write code to send a billing number in all of our systems. For instance, Prescribe It doesn't, right? So that was where the question first came up.
So I'm just, before I go to Michelle, Rita, like I heard you confirm the billing feedback, which is there's more use cases than prescription. I also heard you mention the NUPI. Is this something that you want to like raise as a discussion topic, which is like, are there use cases that we should be identifying where this wouldn't occur, or either currently or should in the future, to influence the feedback? And then we can have that discussion, and if that's what you kind of want to target next.
Well, the billing thing is, there are many cases where you do need the the doctor's billing number. For example, if you're doing a referral, you have to put in your CPSO number, and you have to put in your OHIP billing number if you're going to refer. So having that as a can send is not, I don't think, unreasonable. But the NUPI or the MINC code, nobody knows that. So I'm more concerned about the NUPI code being can send. Billing I can see as being can send, because there are times when you do need it. So when you do need it, I think it's important that the system be able to support it.
Well, that means that you're asking all systems to write code to be able to support it, even if they don't or never will send it. I can certainly see putting a can send on the identifier itself, but putting can send on the slices of the different types of identifiers, I think for the core, not for specific use cases, but for the core, I think that's a step too far.
Is that specific feedback, Lorraine, that you want to provide, or like, are there counterpoints?
Sure.
Okay.
I agree with Lorraine. I mean, this core is going to be taken out by jurisdictions, and then at the jurisdiction they can say, no, you have to provide this slice.
So I'm going to pause there. I don't want to get, because I think that this is probably our next point of discussion. Rita, I saw that your hand was still up, and then Michelle, I saw your hand went up a little bit ago. Rita, is that?
It could go down by itself. Sometimes
okay.
they go down by themselves.
So then I'm going to go to Michelle, and then I'm going to circle back to Lorraine's comment around identifier, but not slices.
Okay, I'm going to try real hard to be brief. And so this, Rita's pivoting off of your point, and I wonder if, in addition to the standard that we're reviewing today, if there would need to be peripheral conversations around the nature in which we are using this standard. So if, for example, there be maybe a longer or more robust transactional conversation of, if yes, the consent. So in addition to this conversation and your efforts here, does there need to be an accounting for conversations for the transactional process to basically confirm information? So it's not being like super technical, but basically saying, like, do you know the patient? Yes, I do. You got any documents? Yes, I do. Can I have them? Yes, you can. So it almost that, but with these other use cases here to get data that wouldn't otherwise be known, to be able to complete the overall workflow.
So are you saying like to drive the context around like more specificity in the actors who this might be relevant to?
Yeah, so there's this standard that is being established, and there's this Canada Core. So accounting for the components to the standard is great, but I would see a potential need for additional documentation to set expectations on which pieces of data should be had and how those should be required, rather than it be just in sort of one-hit wonder transactions. That some of these might require transactional sort of back and forth conversations to request and get the information from other disparate sources in order to actually complete the main goal of the request. I think about, for example, maybe it's not a great example, but like prior auths or pre-authorization for services where there may need to be that back and forth. I don't mean, I apologize, that was not brief, but I meant to be sort of just kind of flagging this is great, and there may need to be follow-on conversations to set expectations around how all that information can be acquired to complete the transactional request.
I think that's a really fair point, and I don't have the full answer to cover kind of the full context, but what I can say is in conversations that we've had around the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework, the idea is that there are going to be elements that are present in the framework that may not all be part of the standard that governs exchange or the standard expectations for certain types of parties in certain contexts. So what I would say is I think the bigger picture of, what are the elements that we expect would be captured for a fulsome use case will definitely show up in some of the conversations around the framework. You may not, so much as to say that don't read what we have identified for the box around exchange as this covers everything in the framework, because we know that it's just focused on the standardized elements for exchange in kind of this more agnostic set of use cases, or more generalized set of use cases. Lorraine, I saw you have a comment.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things Michelle was talking about should and will come out in specific use case and context implementation guides, but not necessarily in the core itself, which needs to be more broadly applicable.
And to that point, like there are some places as one of the authors where I've noted some comments around like, we think this might be more registry oriented, but we're looking for feedback, right? Like this is something that's coming up, but maybe it wouldn't make sense in a general profile. I'm going to come back to that, but I want to go back first to the comment you made, Lorraine, around discussing CanSend, whether or not having CanSend, no errors applied to some of these more contextual identifiers is something that we would want to see kind of perpetuated in the next round of versions. And I'll look at that right here. So to Jason's point, it's a 0 to many cardinality for identifier currently. Lorraine, your thinking is that with CanSend and no error, that we'd be looking at essentially just its application here to say like, are you capable of sending it? And if you receive it, are you capable of not erroring it? Are there counterpoints around why, and I'm driving discussion because ultimately we want to get to feedback, why we might want to have the CanSends and no errors on these slices?
And my comment was specifically around the CanSend.
Just CanSend, okay.
Not necessarily the no error, right? Because that's a lower bar for systems. Is that if they don't care about the billing number, for instance, they just ignore it if they get it. But
So
the CanSend in particular creates a implementation expectation of the systems we're talking about.
So I'm going to just try to, I'm just writing it down so we can refine it as we go. Unfortunately, I don't know if Elliot's on this call, so I'm going to play both roles, just FYI. But we won't formally ask for the motion until we've got to a place where we have comfortable. So you were saying CanSend in particular may not be appropriate for slices given for the identifier slices, given that they are more contextual. and maybe more use case specific. Am I capturing this?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to express it.
Jason, I saw you with your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I was just listening to all this and like looking at what we profiled it in US Core, right? Like, the reason I asked about identifier zero to many here is like, I think it solves a lot of problems with identifiers because pretty much every provider, every practitioner has an identifier, right? Depending on whether it's the, what was it, the NUPI, the registration, the billing, whatever it is, right? So if you have a cardinality of 1 to many, right, you have to send at least something, right? If everybody has an NUPI number, then you would say, okay, well, that one is a can send, and everyone has to support that. And then what you can also do is give guidance that says like, and you must, you can get as strong as you want, then you should send all other identifiers that you know, and then maybe list some like in specifically send the registration identifier, send the billing identifier. And that just really means like send everything you got, try to send as much as you can, but we recognize that not everybody has a billing. It captures the billing, captures the registration, or captures some of the other identifiers that you want to send, but it's flexible enough and it's got enough binding to say like, okay, well, you have to send one, you should send as many as you can, and let everybody kind of implement it what they can do.
Yes, but this particular constraint on the element says you must be able to send each of these element types, which
Right.
isn't quite what you said, right?
Right. That's what I was saying. I was like, you can back off of like of the numbers that you have as the identifiers that you have, like which ones, is there any of those three that like universally everybody has? Right? Like
It varies a bit by jurisdiction here.
Okay.
So for instance, the jurisdictional registries guide that I've been involved in specifies that at least one slice of the practitioner.identifier must be, the commonly understood, I guess the equivalent to the NPI number, but for BC. So it says you, in that case, particularly for the registries profile, you must send that. And then you can send other things, right? But that's not the same as putting an obligation that everyone can send those types. And then it's also a use case specific constraint as opposed to the Canadian Core, which is, we do certainly expect that you're going to send an identifier, although there, in some resources, there might be use cases where an identifier is not available, so it's optional, or there's a data absent reason. But so saying can send on identifier itself, I don't have any problem with. But saying can send on specific slices, I think, is more constrained than we want to be in the core.
Right. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at, like send identifier, but not be very, you may not have to be very specific on which slices, or you can recommend like in the verbiage of the IG that says like, okay, you have an obligation to be able to send an identifier. And but you should send all the identifiers you have, right? Which basically means like, if you just have the NUPI number, you just send that and you're fine. You can send an identifier. That's the only identifier you have. You meet the guidance. You meet the requirement. If you have the NUPI number, the registration number, and the billing number, and you send all of them, then you're doing great. So like, that's where like, we say this a lot when we build our US core, right? Just like you can in CA Core, right? And say like, what is the minimum requirements that everybody can support to make sure that everybody has a baseline of saying, this is what everybody at least can do. Everyone can provide an identifier, but we're not specific on the exact identifiers, and that gets you to a spot. And then through implementation and through different versions, you can say, okay, well, you know what? Everybody has an NUPI number or an equivalency of that. So now we can make that slice specifically required, right? It's like that's one way to definitely do this, is to just say like, okay, we want to make sure the element is there, but we're not going to mandate a slice.
Rita, I saw you go off mute.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to ask, so what exactly is the NUPI number? Because this is the first I've heard of it. Like I've heard of the MINC numbers, but not NUPI numbers. What are they?
I
And
think
who
it's
uses
still
them?
like a little bit of a placeholder in the definition of like if they're aligned to an existing one or if it's something that doesn't yet exist. And so this was one where kind of back and forth on whether or not we consider it like a stretch goal and should identify it as something that would be more like a placeholder versus applying a consent. But I don't know if from the, and I think our Kai lead dropped off, we could probably follow up with if the expectation is that it aligns to an existing number.
Well, and the NPI number that Jason's referring to is a US identifier for providers.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've never heard of NUPI before, and I've been in healthcare for a while. And even the MINC numbers, I know they exist, but nobody knows what they are. I mean, nobody knows their MINC number. They'd have to look it
Yeah,
up. They'd have
yeah,
to-
NUPI in this context, I would agree with you. I actually didn't know what that was.
So since nobody even really knows what it is or what number we want to put in there, I think we're a bit pushing it to say that it's going to be CanSend.
So do you guys have like a Canada equivalent or a province equivalent to like the US NPI number? Like every registered provider or clinician gets this number in
We have a
either
medical
Canada or the province?
we have a medical identification number for Canada, the MINC number, and it's assigned to every Canadian entering the medical education system or practice system. So they get it when they first go into their first year of residency, prior to their first year residency. So most doctors have one. If they don't have one, they can apply for one. But once they finish medical school and they're practicing, nobody knows what their MINC number is.
It's not captured in like the
So they have one.
system during.
They have to look it up. And if they
Yeah.
don't have it because they weren't Canadian students, so they're foreign trained, then they have to apply for one. But it's not commonly used. It's only used so that you can tie people together who have a College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario number and possibly one from Alberta as well. And they're two different provincial licenses. And
Right.
you would tie those two different registration numbers together with the MINC number, the one MINC number.
MINC is national. Yeah.
Interesting.
Make
Okay,
is
thanks.
national,
Rob.
but there are numbers in each jurisdiction that are specifically used for interactions with the registries. And the registries, for instance, the BC provider registry, the entries in that provider in the registry all come from the colleges. And then there's an identifier that's got to do with their billing identifier as well. But of course, we talked about the fact that some systems like the registries use the billing identifier, but some of the pharmacy systems don't. So there are jurisdictionally local numbers that are more commonly used than MINC.
Well,
But
all
it
the
varies
provinces have their own license numbers, right? So you have
That's
the
right. Yeah.
Ontario license number. So every province licenses its own doctors, and that's why you need the MINC. Because people who are practicing in Ontario want to go practice in Newfoundland have to re-register in Newfoundland and get a Newfoundland license as well.
Yeah.
So the MINC number would tie it together if you wanted to tie them together.
Michelle, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I love this conversation so much. It makes me wonder if MINC was chosen because of the nature of it being a national identifier that every provider should have, but it's just that the practice right now is not to know it or maybe even document it anywhere that it can be grabbed even. And so I guess that's just one of those it's a spin-off conversation of there may be data elements that are accounted for in this standard that are not widely used or used in a consistent way that would require sort of ripple-on conversations, maybe even accounting for it in terms of how that information is captured in the workflow or system configuration or databases or whatever. That was a comment, not really a question of I think just read it from just the insights you've provided. It sounds like MINC exists and it would probably be a really great universal identifier for providers. It's just not today. It's just not consistently captured or referenced.
Well, it's out there and we can use it. I mean, nobody uses it for very much right now, but I mean,
Right.
we could. if we did, I mean, I still think we're a bit premature at saying that it's got to be a can send, since people would have to scramble to look up their MINC number. Physicians.
But if there was, say, conversation to say, hey, here are some data elements that we would be looking to leverage as part of this new standard. Hey, everybody out there, get ready, because these are some things you'll need to think about how to more consistently capture or reference.
And when we say like can know, like, are we expecting that like the clinician knows it like while they're entering information? Or are we just talking about like stored in the EHR? Because like what we're really like hoping is that it's just stored in the EHR, right? Like in the practitioner dictionary, it's like, you know, provider
Somewhat.
Joe Schmo and their numbers are 8, 1, 2, 3 and 4, 5, 6. I know that's not the format, but like, and then you'd be able to send those. Like, I feel like if everybody has a MINC number, MINC number and a province number, it seems like you'd want to try to profile those, that they should always be sent so that you have that information as part of the,
I also have another
Yes.
thought, is that the MINC numbers are for physicians, for medical schools, Canadian medical. And so, the other practitioners would not have one, like nurses and.
Oh, okay.
Naomi, I'm just gonna mute you real quick. Sorry, Rita. Good.
Yeah, that's true, Rita. So particularly for systems that have to interact with the provider registries in each province, then there'll be a specific jurisdictional identifier that's commonly in use for that conversation, and it's been in use for the legacy systems before fire too. But for other systems that aren't necessarily supporting that particular interaction, and the example that came up last week was Prescribe It, which is the system that supports electronic prescribing between doctors and pharmacy providers. They don't necessarily use the provincial billing number. So it's which of the slices that need to be there will vary based on context. So from the core, we could say you need to support an identifier and send an identifier, but saying which type of identifier from core, I think is, again, as I said, I think it's a step too far from core.
So I'm going to respond to that, and then I'm going to go to Randy, which is to say, like, I'm going to respond to it more from a facilitator perspective, which is to say, what I'm hearing is that we're looking at kind of current state and our expectations for core. And we're saying that particularly in the current state where this NUPI may not be fully identified, we don't know whether or not it would refer back to MINC. And if it does, that it may not be actively readily used in a lot of production workflows. And for that reason, CanSend may not make sense. I'm also hearing a perspective that is that the core and the framework may help us drive better practices in place and use things like CanSend to help drive around that. What I want to put into people's brains is that when we structure feedback, we don't necessarily have to say like something simplistic, like, well, remove it or don't remove it. There's been cases, in the framework or in the feedback that we provided where we can say, well, we would recommend removing or providing further guidance on X, or pursuing or proposing an alternative approach to accomplish this. So we don't have to do single kind of if this, then that statements. We can be more sophisticated. So I'm going to let Randy go, and then I'm going to make a call back to say, like, what do we change about what's written in this comment on the screen that is something that everybody's kind of comfortable with, is that drives towards what we want, and like to the point where we can kind of make the motion to submit that as feedback. So think about that, and then Randy, you have your hand up.
I was just going to say that, excuse me, that anything you want to attach a CanSend to has to be something that really is like universally used, because putting it on anything that in a jurisdiction that never uses the value means we have to validate that anybody operating in our or making an implementation in our jurisdiction can send this, even though we'll never ever use it. So it's got to be at the level of things that really truly are used across the country. But for a concept that's something that currently isn't currently used across the country, but that would be suggested as a good idea, we got to have something like a should send kind of thing. Like a suggestion that you should send it if you can, but not making it that it's expected that you will be able to send it in every instance, because otherwise, particularly for legacy applications that don't have the values and stuff, they're going to start failing them because they can't send it because they don't even have a value to put in there ever. And that's the risk you take by putting this kind of constraint on things that are not truly currently universal.
So to that point, a tool that we have in our arsenal with obligations, while it's, some people love it, some people hate it, we have modifier codes that we can use. So when we look at obligations like can send or will send or populate with data absent reason if empty, we have the option to modify that with shalls, shoulds, or mays. In all the cases, I think the way that it's currently modeled, it's shall can send, but it's something that we could consider moving forward if there were items like this. So I'm going to bring this back to the feedback that I've kind of drafted up based on what I've heard so far for changes. Are there things that need to change on what's written on line 15 for us to feel comfortable doing this? And that will help us kind of further discussion. Is there like a modifier that we want to put in? Are we comfortable saying, you know, our primary request is that this be relaxed, kind of end stop?
I would just suggest putting that extra bit in that if it's something that's desired as a future goal, that it should be under that, you know, should instead of shall constraint or modifier.
So if the expectations on the identifier slices, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I feel like we landed on the obligation to send identifier, but not on an obligation to send any of the specific slices.
Should modifier. Was it for those that aren't, that are more reach goals?
For those that aren't not universal across the country, right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, it sounds like there's not a universal identifier that everybody has, and there's differences everywhere you go. So like the idea of if I'm attributing this similar to must support, it means like for everybody that has an identifier, you're going to send the identifier. If you don't have the identifier, you won't send it, but you still meet the requirements of the IG because when you have it, you can send it. So you have an obligation to send it when you have it. So as long as you can send an identifier when it's captured, you're good. And everybody captures some identifier, so we'll just send the ones we have.
And then
Well,
you can
I'm
use
not-
this should approach to put a recommended or desired identifier to use nationally that we don't currently have. That's what I would see it being used for.
Yeah, I'm not particularly comfortable with the should send in the core on this one, personally. I could see it in specific use cases, like a registry's implementation guide, but in the overall core, I'm not so sure.
Why don't I break it out so we can talk about them independently? If there are examples, like we're using this against the example of identifier right now. So if I'm looking at this from, let me just see if I can, of course I don't have wrapping. Like Randy, are you comfortable, like, given that we have like a few minutes left, having this be one of the items that we flesh out and really have a discussion on, are we, like, do we want to recommend this approach just more generically outside of identifier?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, I would see that as the approach to use in general, rather than going that really hard constraint. So like Lorraine was saying, it is kind of somewhat use case specific. So
I agree. I think we should say can send on the identifier level, but not specify which identifier you have to send And if you did want to specify one identifier, I'd go with the provincial registration number, because those tend to be universally assigned.
So Rita, you're saying you'd modify this to say like, we think can send is probably appropriate on identifier, but probably not appropriate right now on the identifier slices.
Right.
Because I'm going to call this for someone to motion for this in a second when we get this written. So prepare your off mute buttons. Unless, do folks think that we need more refinement of what is written on line 15, independent of the line 16 or other ways to address it?
I'm just rereading it once you're finished typing.
I can put these in quotes. Any modifications or further discussion that we think we would need on this one?
I think feel is a wishy-washy word. We're making an assertion.
We take the view.
Yeah. So I'm wondering about the parenthetical piece at the bottom, but in addition to some potentially acting as placeholders.
Do you want me to break it out? Into
Sure. I mean, I could move this without that, with no problem.
Or is anyone uncomfortable with this being broken out as a separate item for follow-up discussion on next session? This in highlight.
We can just take that out. It doesn't add to what we're saying. Can't send is not appropriate for the slices.
Okay.
And just leave it at that.
I can
Go ahead.
I can make that motion. I don't know if we have a second.
I can second it.
All right. I have to follow Elliot's syntax 1 second. Okay. And is anyone not comfortable, like maybe you've been chatting with your family and on the other line and you haven't got this conversation, or you're just not quite to the place you feel comfortable saying, I would assert one way or the other, positive or negative, and would want to abstain? Would anyone feel like, you know, I don't agree with this and I don't feel this is the feedback that we need to put forward, and would vote negative? All
I
right.
feel like this is Michelle, I feel like I would probably abstain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other abstentions? All right. Anyone who would feel like they would vote negative? All right. Then I'm putting it down as 1014. And this will be feedback that we submit. So.
Do you guys follow the HL7 format? Because it'd be 1401, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, 1401.
Let me see. We might have to correct the one that's up here. Oh, no, he's got it.
1500 and
Yeah,
1401.
there we go.
Okay.
So perfect timing. So we will return to the kind of item that we started to flesh out on topic 16 next time, and then continue our review of the remaining kind of elements and against the both mappings and the can send no error obligations, and explore kind of that should, may, shall at our next session. But we got one in today, which is brilliant. We're making progress. I will see you folks next time, and you can look forward to the recording going up on the YouTube next couple hours.
Have a good weekend,
Great.
everyone.
Thanks,
Good
folks.
call.
Weekend people.
Very
Have a
nice
great
for
weekend.
people, so many people to join. It's really appreciated.
Yep. All right, cheers. Restful weekend.
Thanks, y'all. Ta-ra.